Now, a warning to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers that the following may contain images of deceased persons. Hobart City Council has voted to remove a statue of former Tasmanian Premier William Crowther from the city centre. The reason for this historic precedent? Crowther is the man who in 1869 broke into the morgue and stole the skull of Aboriginal man William Lanny and sent it to an English museum, all in the name of scientific research.
We're in a place in society now where, as uncomfortable as it may be, we're ready to acknowledge the injustices of the past and start to deal with them.
Professor Chelsea Watego is a Mununjali and South Sea Islander woman and joins us now to discuss this historic decision. Chelsea, how did you feel when you heard the news?
Look, I was, certainly pleased by the decision. In the lead up around the discussions, that there was talk about this being a conversation starter. It was pleasing to see that they stood in favour of what the community was seeking.
Chelsea, the more you read about Crowther, the more you wonder why is there such a huge monument standing pride of place in the centre of Hobart. Amongst all the things that he did, what was the scientific research for?
Look, I think it's important to place his behaviour in its broader context, and that is he was not just a bad apple. In fact, scientific racism has a long history in this country and has been a central part of the colonial project to intellectually rationalise the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. And, the medical professional has been part of the colonial violence that has been visited upon Indigenous peoples. And so I think if you look at the history of the health sciences in this country, there are so many stories to be told about the violence of health and medical sciences in this country.
So Crowther was trying to prove some kind of ridiculous notion of racial superiority.
Yeah, and so the medical researcher was part of this colonial violence in terms of rationalising, making the case that we were intellectually inferior, that we weren't human. And you don't have to look very far into our history to see these kinds of accounts being produced under the guise of medical science.
This is an ongoing discussion about the removal of other statues. Do you think we've learnt anything here about how we go forward about making these decisions, what statues stand and what statues don't?
Well, I think this is, there was discussion about, concern that this erases our history. This move and other moves like it gives us an opportunity to actually understand our full history in this country. And so I think it's pleasing to see this decision being made, but also the conversations we're getting to have about understanding how racial violence has been foundational to this place. And it's not just about moving statues, but actually this nation reconciling its own history with itself and being prepared to celebrate a history that predates their presence. And I think, the fact that we don't see many monuments of Aboriginal warriors, of Aboriginal resistance fighters, speaks to this country's refusal to recognise Aboriginal excellence, Aboriginal presence in this place.
It's interesting to hear you say that. Are you more concerned with the establishment of those sorts of monuments than you are the destruction of current ones?
I don't think it's an either or. I think this is about this nation reconciling its relationship with itself, but also reconciling what kind of relationship it wants to have with Indigenous peoples moving forward.
Professor Watego, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Some really good points that Professor Watego made just then. The scientific research that was conducted in those days is so upsetting. There is an abundance of culture and an abundance of First Nations people in Lutruwita, Tasmania, that is being celebrated now, as it should have been then. And there are still the fish traps that are thousands and thousands of years old. When you talk about who's inferior or who's superior, just look at the things that are still standing. The middens, the evidence of a very sophisticated culture and a way of life that was there in those days. And then you look at a statue that's from the 1800s that's of a man who was a premier for 1 year.
That's what's odd about it.
And he pretty much built it himself, the statue. No one else was going to build it for William Crowther. So, the message here is for communities to look at the monuments that they've got and ask, who is that person and who is more worthy of being there?